Hello Year 6 and welcome to your Year 6 English lesson, Lesson 3. As always, you'll need something to write with and you'll need your home learning book or paper to write on. Before we get started with today's feature, let's recap on the features we've looked at so far this week. Pause your video and write down the 2 features we've already focused on. Okay, let's have a look. Did you remember to write down expanded noun phrases? Well done if you did. Did you remember to write down parenthesis? Great job. Now we're going to pause the video again, and I'd like you to write down the definitions for these features. Okay, let's have a go. Expanded noun phrases. An expanded noun phrase adds description. It includes a determiner, an adjective, and a noun. Well done if you remembered that. Parenthesis. Parenthesis means extra information, afterthought, clarify or interrupt, punctuated with brackets, commas, dashes, can be taken away and the sentence still works. Well done if you remembered all that, Year 6. This week our task is to write the opening to Cloud Busting as a narrative. We will focus on really introducing the characters to the reader through character description. We will share this writing with our adults at home, so they know all about the characters from the book. Our narrative will be based on the characters from our destination reader book, Cloud Busting, and today we get to introduce Davy. Pause your video and write down our purpose for writing this week and our audience. You should have written down that we're doing a detailed character description, describing the characters. You should have also written down that our audience is going to be our adults at home. They have not read the book, they do not know the characters, so it's our job to introduce them very well. If you remember our writing from yesterday, Sam has just mentioned Davy. So let's get started with today's feature. I'm going to read along and I'd like you to follow. Pay particular attention to the features in red. The name, which had just been uttered, hung in the room like a deflating party balloon. Slightly taken aback by the question, the teacher nodded slowly, in the affirmative, and quickly switched his focus to another child in the room. And you, Alicia, who will you write about? Alicia, who was normally of great interest to Sam, could have been a million miles away, for her voice was nothing but a dull hum in the background. The boy remained instead with his thoughts of Davy. He would never forget that moment when it first happened. Like all the children, he had been bored and fidgeting in the assembly hall. The sweet and sickly smell of polish still clung on the wooden floor that had been cleaned over the summer. Davy, who was a new face in the school, sat with his long, spindly legs crossed very awkwardly in front of him on the floor. Sam could see how the children gawked at this new boy's tatty shirt, which was frayed at the collar. Sam could hear them snigger at the holes in the boy's jumper. It was clear that Davy was not well off. It was even more clear that he did not seem to mind. Perhaps it was this new boy's indifference to the stares and smirks that did it. Perhaps it was the way Alicia smiled at the lanky new boy. Whatever it was, it made Sam fume. So let's have a look at the feature highlighted in red. What is this feature? And as a challenge, what effect does this feature have on the reader? Okay, let's have a look at our feature for today. To use relative clauses to add detail when describing characters. Did you spot that the highlighted features were all relative clauses? Well done if you did. Relative clauses are subordinate clauses. They adapt, describe, or modify a noun. They add information to sentences. They begin or imply a relative pronoun. Relative clauses are subordinate clauses. They adapt, describe, or modify a noun. They add information to sentences. They begin or imply a relative pronoun. Let's have a closer look at these relative pronouns. Relative pronouns relate back to the noun which they are adding information to. We can use relative pronouns such as who, which, that, whose, what, when, with. That's a list of some examples of relative pronouns. Instead of repeating a noun over and over again, we can use these relative pronouns to refer back to the noun when we're adding information. Relative clauses are subordinate clauses. They adapt, describe, or modify a noun. They add information to sentences. They begin or imply a relative pronoun. The boy, who was sat in the classroom, tried to listen to the teacher. I've added extra information to my noun, the boy, with this relative clause. In red, I have my relative pronoun, who. It is relating back to the boy. The lesson, which seemed to last an eternity, had something to do with poetry. I've used a relative clause, which seemed to last an eternity, and I'm using this to modify the noun when I talk about the lesson. Which is my relative pronoun and relates back to the lesson. Notice how the person in the first sentence, the boy, uses the relative pronoun who, because we're talking about a person. The lesson in the second sentence is an object, which is used to describe that object. The chair that had once belonged to Davy was empty. Can you see how that relative clause is embedded in the middle with a pair of commas, and the relative pronoun that is used to relate back to the object, the chair. The table where Davy had once sat was empty. Where is my relative pronoun, and it relates back to my noun, the table. Where Davy had once sat is my relative clause, and it's embedded, surrounded by commas. The boy stared at the table where Davy had once sat. Where is my relative pronoun and relates back to the table. Where Davy had once sat is my relative clause. See how it comes at the end of the sentence, so no commas are needed. If it's embedded into the middle of the main clause, it needs commas to embed it. If the relative clause comes at the end of the sentence, no commas are needed. The boy stared at the table where Davy had once sat. He would never forget the boy whose jumper was frayed and tatty. He would never forget that day when he last saw the boy. The relative clauses come at the end of these sentences. They do not need a comma. Do you recognise these two examples from yesterday's lesson when we added parenthesis? Adding relative clauses is like adding parenthesis. It's extra information. So let's see it working again. The boy was trying hard to listen to the teacher. The boy who fidgeted in his seat. I've added a relative clause with a relative pronoun and used commas to embed it. The boy who fidgeted in his seat. I've added a relative clause, but this time used dashes to add this information. The boy who fidgeted in his seat, and again I've added a relative clause, but used brackets to embed the clause. let's look at that second example. The boy was trying hard to listen to the teacher. I'm adding the information at the end, when they were speaking. I don't need to add punctuation for this relative clause. So let's have a look at which of these sentences has used relative clauses correctly. Number 1, the boy who sat quietly in the classroom thought of his missing classmate. Number 2, who will you write about? Asked the teacher. Number 3, the boy stared at the empty chair where Davy had once sat. Pause your video and have a go and see if you can find which of these is incorrect. Okay, let's have a look. My first example has an embedded clause with a relative pronoun. So this is a relative clause punctuated correctly. My second example looks like it has a relative pronoun, but this hasn't been used for a relative clause. Who will you write about is using a pronoun, but not a relative pronoun. Number 2 is incorrect. Let's check number 3. Where Davy had once sat uses a relative pronoun, where, to modify the chair, the object, the noun in my sentence. All right, let's have another look. Have I identified the relative clauses correctly, and how do you know? So pause your video and have a go at these 3 examples. Okay, let's have a look together. The boy who had long, lanky legs was called Davy. Can you see how I've got a relative pronoun and a relative clause, and it's embedded with commas? Number 1 is correct. When he looked at the empty chair, he could not help but think of Davy. I do not have a relative pronoun. This is a fronted adverbial. It's telling me when something happened. It's modifying a verb. Number 2 is not the use of a relative clause. Let's check number 3. With a frayed collar and a tatty jumper, the boy, who had only just joined the school, was disliked by Sam. Who had only just joined the school is a relative clause. It starts with a relative pronoun, which is referring back to the noun, the boy, and it's been embedded by commas. Number 3 is correct. Relative clauses are subordinate clauses. They adapt, describe, or modify a noun. They add information to sentences. They begin or imply a relative pronoun. So if you remember our feature today, we're going to use relative clauses to add detail when describing characters. And our character to describe today is Davy. Let's have a look at which sentence is more engaging for the reader. Number 1. The name, which had just been uttered, hung in the room like a deflating party balloon. Number 2. The boy said Davy's name. The words felt uncomfortable to say. Pause the video and decide which one of these is more engaging for the reader and explain why. Okay, let's have a look at number 1. The name, which had just been uttered, hung in the room like a deflating party balloon. By using this relative clause to refer back to the noun, it allows the reader to enjoy the reading. It allows the reader to understand what we're talking about, which noun we are referring to. The second sentence is engaging, but by using the 2 short sentences, it really does stop the flow and doesn't allow the reader time to enjoy the writing. Let's have a look at another one. Which sentence is more engaging for the reader, and how do you know? Number 1. The floor of the hall smelled of sickly sweet polish. The smell hung in the air. Number 2. The sweet and sickly smell of polish still clung to the wooden floor that had been cleaned over the summer. Pause the video and decide which example you find more engaging as a reader. Let's have a look. I think the second example, by using the relative clause, allows a flow for this writing. It also clarifies that the children have just come back to school. The floor was cleaned over the summer. That extra information allows me to set the scene and to know more about our characters returning to school. The first example is also a very good example, but again with those two short sentences, it really stops the flow for the reader. Okay, time to help me improve my writing. Help me add in relative clauses. Davy sat with his legs crossed in front of him on the floor. Sam could see how the children looked at this new boy's tatty shirt. Pause the video and have a go at editing and refining my work by adding in some relative clauses. Okay, let's see how you got on. I've identified some places where I feel relative clauses would really add to the noun and really help the description. Here's my example. Davy, who was a new face in the school, sat with his long spindly legs crossed very awkwardly in front of him on the floor. Sam could see how the children gawked at this new boy's tatty shirt, which was frayed at the collar. Did you notice anything about my improvements to my writing? Not only have I used today's feature of relative clauses, I've also ensured that I've added in an expanded noun phrase and parenthesis. I've got an expanded noun phrase, his long spindly legs. Doesn't that really help you picture the character? I've added in some parenthesis, very awkwardly, to really help you know what this character's like. As well as this, I've used today's feature, the relative clauses. Who was the new face in the school? And right at the end, which was frayed at the collar. Okay, Year 6, now it's your turn. Your writing task today is to introduce Davy into the narrative. We need to let the reader know how Sam feels about Davy and build a picture of him in their mind. Give a vivid description of Davy using relative clauses, as well as our other features from this week. Try to show the reader how Sam feels about Davy. Remember, Sam is quite cruel in the way that he describes and thinks of Davy. That tells us a lot about Davy and a lot about Sam as well. Top tip, have a look at Chapter 2, What's in a Name. This will help you to describe Davy better. If you think you're ready, you can pause your video now and begin your writing. You'll want to give yourself about 20 to 30 minutes to really describe Davy. As always, you've got a definition of today's feature on your board, and I can't wait to read your writing at the end of the day. Good luck, Year 6. If you need some extra support, stay with the video and we'll go through the example again. Okay, so you need a little bit of extra support, that's fine. We're going to go through the example again from today. We're looking for those relative clauses. The name, which had just been uttered, hung in the room like a deflating party balloon. Slightly taken aback by the question, the teacher nodded slowly in the affirmative and quickly switched his focus to another child in the room. And you, Alicia, who will you write about? Alicia, who was normally of great interest to Sam, could have been a million miles away, for her voice was nothing but a dull hum in the background. The boy remained instead with his thoughts of Davy. He would never forget that moment when it first happened. Like all the children, he had been bored and fidgeting in the assembly hall. The sweet and sickly smell of polish still clung to the wooden floor that had been cleaned over the summer. Davy, who was a new face in the school, sat with his long spindly legs crossed very awkwardly in front of him on the floor. Davy could see how the children gawked at this new boy's tatty shirt, which was frayed at the collar. Sam could hear them snigger at the holes in the boy's jumper. It was clear that Davy was not well off. It was even more clear that he did not seem to mind. Perhaps it was this new boy's indifference to the stares and smirks that did it. Perhaps it was the way Alicia smiled at the lanky new boy. Whatever it was, it made Sam fume. Okay, Year 6. You might want to pause the video and leave this on your screen when you're writing. You're welcome to borrow and use any of my relative clauses from today, but I really would like to see your own writing. Remember, we're describing Davy, and we're really trying to describe Davy through Sam's eyes. Good luck with your writing, and I can't wait to read it. Well done, Year 6.